stop measuring your worth. Zen wisdom for deep sleep anxiety relief. Right now, a hot, sour friction is tightening directly between your shoulder blades, a persistent and deeply draining ache that forms when your mind circles around old family roles and the heavy weight of childhood comparison. You are lying down to rest, yet your posture is locked in a silent competition against a sibling's shadow, your inner thoughts endlessly tallying old slights, achievements, or moments where you felt small, outshone, or fundamentally misunderstood. It is the long, exhausting momentum of family stature, the somatic memory of trying to prove you are enough to a circle that defined your value before you even knew your own heart. A deep dread of being secondary or permanently invisible settles into your bones, making you feel as though you must continuously run just to earn your basic right to be seen. The immediate space around your bed has assumed a rustic, earthbound quietness tonight, filled with the sharp, clean scent of pungent pine resin and the cool texture of damp mountain soil drifting through the open window boards. Outside, the low, steady whisper of the wind passing through two distinct heights of needles reveals that the mountain ridge is completely untroubled, by which branch reaches higher into the mist. Inside this room, you are entirely released from the obligation to outperform, outshine, or justify your position within your lineage. Yet your intellect is likely pacing, replaying ancient family dynamics and treating this quiet evening as an unvoiced arena where you must defend your stature. Please know, dear friend, that you are not broken, and the profound sense of inadequacy you are navigating tonight is not a personal failure or a sign that you have lagged behind. What you are experiencing is the natural, aching fatigue of a spirit that has spent a lifetime carrying an invisible measuring stick, trying to force an uncarved life into a rigid family definition. Tonight, we will not force your mind to be silent, nor will we demand that you magically forgive or erase the hurt to deserve your rest. There is no requirement for you to prove your success, or to outgrow anyone else's achievements before your body is permitted to sink into the mattress. We are simply inviting that hot friction between your shoulders to lose its density, trusting the heavy ground to hold you without any effort of your own. This exhausting habit of family comparison carries a beautiful and surprising paradox. The very sibling shadow that makes you feel so small is actually the threshold to a profound, unified freedom. The mind falsely insists that your worth as a living being is a competitive resource, convincing you that for another to be bright, you must be cast into the dark. But deep Buddhist insight reveals that comparing two expressions of the same lineage is like a wave trying to outrun the very sea that gives it form. Your value is an inherent, unmeasurable reality that belongs to pure awareness, completely independent of your place in the family hierarchy. You do not exist to be the strongest, the smartest, or the most decorated branch. Your presence is fully complete even when you are completely invisible to the world. Non-comparison is not the loss of stature, it is the realization that your roots share the exact same ground. Right now, if it feels right, take a slow breath, letting the clean, penescented air fill the center of your chest without forcing a specific pattern or a rhythmic depth. There is absolutely no need to solve your whole life tonight, and nothing is required of you except to notice how heavy it has been to carry this unvoiced competition for so many years. Maybe you have felt this too, this sudden wave of childhood regression during a brief phone call or a modern holiday gathering. But you are safe enough to soften the rigid brace across your ribs right now. You do not have to earn your place at the table by completing one more monument of success before your eyes are allowed to close. The night has no scorecards for you to fill. Imagine two distinct mountain pine trees growing from a single, narrow granite ledge high above the valley floor. One tree reaches tall and straight into the upper sunlight, its wood polished by the high winds, its cones large and visible to everyone who climbs the path. The other pine grows lower, its trunk twisting sideways across the rock, its branches sweeping down toward the cool shadows of the lower gorge. For decades, the wind has moved through their needles with different pitches, and from the outside, they appear to be two completely separate forces competing for the exact same scrap of mountain sky. But beneath the unforgiving stone, deep within the dark, silent fissures of the mountain, their roots fold over each other, intertwining so completely that they drink from the exact same vein of water, sharing a single, quiet nourishment that knows no division. This is exactly how your nervous system becomes paralyzed when you treat your siblings' trajectory as a measure of your own failure, viewing their growth as a theft of your own light. The hot friction between your shoulders is not an indicator that your life is lacking. It is merely the sign that your awareness is being called to drop beneath the surface of the stone, returning to the shared ground that feeds all expressions of life. Finding peace within this space requires no frantic effort to prove your independence, no forced displays of confidence, and no intellectual defense. In a moment, we will explore this profound transition through the story of a temple monk who lived in the shadow of his brilliant brother, learning that a rough clay jar does not lose its utility just because its lines are uneven. Let your body sink completely into the dark as we travel to a cold temple cellar, where the damp soil rests in the quiet mountain. Deep within the cold, cedar-shrouded temple valley, where the winter frosts lingered longest in the hollows, a young monk named Seiji lived in a state of permanent, unvoiced constriction. For as long as his memory could reach, his entire existence had been measured against the brilliant, immaculate trajectory of his older brother, who had effortlessly mastered the complex temple liturgies, won the praise of the elder abbots, and been chosen to lead the great assembly halls. Seiji had been relegated to the quiet, unglamorous upkeep of the lower grounds, a man whose internal world was entirely consumed by the agonizing habit of feeling unpolished, secondary, and profoundly small. He felt as though he were merely a clumsy footprint left in the mud beside a perfect stone path. Every time his brother's eloquent voice echoed from the upper pavilion, a hot, sour tightness would clamp down between Seiji's shoulder blades, paralyzing his chest with the desperate, exhausting urge to somehow match that towering height. The physical focus of Seiji's deep internal evaluation tonight was a rough-hewn clay storage jar, which he had been tasked with moving into the dark temple root cellar. This old vessel was used to hold coarse mountain salt, its surface primitive and unglazed, marked only by two highly uneven parallel lines scratched into the damp clay by a long-ago potter before it was fired. The upper line was high, straight, and beautifully uniform, while the lower line was shallow, wavering, and dipped dangerously close to the rounded base of the jar. For years, every time Seiji reached into the vessel to scoop out the heavy grain salt, his fingers would trace those two conflicting marks, and his intellect would instantly convert the clay into an unyielding diagram of his own lineage. He saw the straight, high line as his brother's flawless ascent, and the lower, wandering scratch as the definitive proof of his own inadequate, stumbling life. Instead of finding peace within the quiet routine of the monastery, Seiji interpreted his humble assignment as an act of familial exile, an unshakable proof that he was simply not enough to merit the light of the main hall. Lying flat upon his straw mat in the drafty monk's quarters, his upper torso remained locked in a rigid defensive brace, his mind relentlessly replaying childhood gatherings, where he had shrunk into the background while his brother was celebrated. The texture of the night felt thick and heavy with his resentment, and every time the wind rattled the paper window screens, his heart would race with a phantom necessity to defend his worth. He was treating his own bitter, comparative thoughts as an absolute truth, exhausting his nervous system by trying to figure out how to carve a more impressive mark into his history. When the midnight dampness began to rise from the valley floor, making the stone walls sweat with a cold, mineral moisture, Seiji could no longer endure the friction in his mind. He lifted the heavy, salt-crusted clay jar from its corner and carried it down a steep flight of narrow steps, entering the deep, unlit temple root cellar where the winter provisions were kept. The atmosphere within this subterranean chamber was entirely removed from the grand architecture above, smelling deeply of damp soil, dried burdock root, and the clean, pungent tang of fermenting cedar vats. In the far corner of this dark vault sat an elderly temple herbalist named Master Nyogen, a man who had lived in the cellar for decades, entirely content to spend his days sorting shriveled roots in the dim glow of an unshielded candle. Nyogen did not offer a grand lecture on the poison of envy, nor did he instruct Seiji to cultivate a more loving attitude toward his family tree. He moved with a dense, heavy slow motion that seemed to belong to the earth itself, his weathered hands covered in a fine layer of dry, dark garden loam. When CG set the primitive clay jar down on the stone floor with a dull thud, confessing his exhaustion, his deep sense of smallness, and the bitter agony of always being the lesser line, the old herbalist did not answer with words. Instead, Nogan reached into a woven straw bin, pulled out a large, unrefined handful of the coarse mountain salt, and held it directly above the wide mouth of the jar. Without looking up at the grand halls above, the old master did not clean the container or try to smooth out the primitive clay. Moving his callous thumb with absolute deliberation, he simply pressed a thick layer of the damp, dark cellar dirt directly over both of the scratched lines, filling the grooves until the high, straight mark and the low, wavering scratch were completely buried under the exact same soil. He looked up at Seiji through the amber candlelight, his face entirely untroubled by the magnificent hierarchy of the upper pavilions, and spoke in a low, resonant whisper that seemed to sink straight into the young monk's bones. "Why do you exhaust your spirit measuring the height of 2 lines scratched into the exterior of the vessel, when the salt inside knows absolutely nothing of the potter's knife, and cures the hunger of the valley from the exact same depth?" Seiji stood perfectly still in the damp darkness of the cellar, the pungent scent of the burdock root filling his lungs as a sudden, profound wave of emotional recognition washed through his locked shoulders. He looked down at the jar where the dark earth had completely leveled the 2 marks, making the exterior surface a single unified field of clay. He realized that the definition he had been fighting for years was not an absolute reality, but an artificial scale he had been tracing with his own fingers in the dark. The hot friction between his shoulder blades gave way to a cool, spacious emptiness, leaving his chest to expand fully within the heavy silence of the root cellar, no longer needing to outgrow anyone to occupy his own space on the earth. The dark, damp layer of garden loam that completely leveled the scratched lines on that primitive salt jar is not an invitation to force your human heart to stop feeling. Nor is it a cold command to turn yourself into an unfeeling shadow that pretends it never wanted to be valued by its own family. This ancient young monk's journey is pointing towards something infinitely quieter, illuminating the precise way we turn our early childhood roles into a lifelong sentence of inadequacy, and how we can find peace when we stop measuring our height against our own blood. The hot, sour friction you feel tightening directly between your shoulder blades tonight is not a proof that you have lagged behind or failed to achieve a valid place in the world. It is simply the natural emotional manifestation of tracing an artificial scale in the dark, trying to force your unique uncarved spirit to match a standard it was never meant to mirror. We spend an immense amount of our nightly vitality attempting to outrun an invisible shadow, completely forgetting that some vessels are meant to be cherished for the purity of what they hold, not the straightness of an exterior mark. True Buddhist wisdom, when translated into the immediate language of your private disorientation, helps us see that our deepest exhaustion does not emerge from the simple reality that a brother or a sister has achieved a different height, won a different praise, or occupied a brighter space in the family history. Those differences are simply the fluid, unyielding movement of life's natural variance, as normal as the twin pines growing into separate pockets of the mountain breeze above the stone. The true suffering was not only in what happened, not only in the reality of the childhood comparison, but in the desperate, agonizing way the mind held what happened, treating another person's brightness as an absolute decree of your own permanent obscurity. We falsely believe that if we can just lock our jaws tighter and continue to tally old family slights, we can somehow force the world to finally grant us the stature we have been denied. When you spend your late night hours replaying old family holiday conversations, checking your achievements against a sibling's timeline, or feeling an acute wave of regression because you still feel invisible around your own lineage, you are independently adding a second wound to the first. The first wound is simply the raw, unpolished weight of human preference, the reality that early environments are often uneven, and that we did not always receive the precise validation our young hearts required to feel secure. The second wound is what your own intellect manufactures when it takes that historical lack and turns it into a fixed personal identity of deficiency, scolding your spirit for its smallness and assuming you must be fundamentally broken because your line wanders close to the base. You take the blunt knife of memory and continuously trace the old scratches in your chest, bruising your own heart to prove you are still locked in the competition. True awareness begins the exact moment you pause that frantic, internal tally and allow your life to exist without an immediate requirement to outperform or outgrow anyone else's shadow. Wisdom is acting like the old cellar master who does not demand that the vessel be refired or smoothed down, but instead recognizes that the salt inside remains completely uncompromised by the marks on the clay. It is the realization that your fundamental validity as a living presence is not a competitive resource that can be stolen by another's success, nor does it require you to occupy the highest branch to deserve your nourishment from the earth. The moment you stop treating your unique path as a failure of stature, the sour friction between your shoulders naturally begins to relinquish its hold on your skeleton. This quiet path shifts your relationship with family history entirely, transforming an old somatic panic into a profound self-compassionate reclamation of your original space. Compassion is the soft, protective understanding that allows your heart to feel the ancient ache of being overlooked without assuming that you are actually secondary or small in the eyes of the universe. The old herbalist did not demand that Seiji compete with the upper assembly halls, or pretend the uneven lines had never been carved into his history. He simply showed him that the deep soil levels all distinctions, feeding the root from the exact same unmeasured depth. You do not need to win the approval of the family circle, or achieve a towering monument of success to be whole tonight. You can simply allow the invisible measuring stick to fall away into the dark, letting your chest expand within the deep, shared peace of the mountain stone. If it feels right to you at this moment, let your awareness gently drift away from the heavy narrative of who you used to compete with and settle entirely within the immediate, physical environment of your resting body. There is absolutely no need to force a sudden state of absolute stillness, or to approach this quiet moment as if it were a test that you must pass before you are allowed to sleep. You are simply a tired living presence, allowing your shoulders to yield to the surface beneath you, permitting the bed to assume the entire responsibility of holding your weight. Perhaps you might begin by tuning into the slow, organic movement of your breath, simply observing the slight, cool touch of air at the back of your throat and the quiet, heavy release that follows each unhurried cycle. As you breathe out, you might invite the hot, sour friction between your shoulder blades to soften its structural grip, even just a tiny fraction of an inch. There is no need to aggressively strip away the inadequacy, or to scold your heart for feeling small, for even the simple act of noticing the hollow space is completely enough to begin a gentle decompression. If you feel a restless momentum in your thoughts, a persistent urge to fix the family position that has developed, or to figure out how you will outgrow a sibling's shadow next, do not try to suppress that impulse. Just let that frantic pacing exist within the wide, spacious cradle of your attention, recognizing that this static is merely the place where your nervous system has been storing the accumulated tension of trying to carry an invisible measuring stick. Perhaps, as you rest in this dim space, a very specific memory of an old comparison, an unvoiced expectation, or a recent moment of family friction will drift into the center of your mind. When it arrives, there is no need to follow it down into the dark, familiar loops of overthinking, and you do not have to fight it to prove your spiritual strength. Just let the thought be seen for what it is, imagining it as a loose, faint line scratched into the primitive exterior of that rough clay storage jar resting on the cold cellar floor. You might give this recurring emotional pattern a soft internal name, saying to yourself, "This is the old habit of tracing my height against another," or "This is the fear of being permanently secondary to the flock." By naming the pattern without judgment, you are gently creating a soft, protective distance between the awareness that observes and the outdated family role that is passing away. Imagine now that the rigid, external scales and past measurements you have been carrying for years are beginning to lose their grip on your identity. If it feels right, you might visualize this internal measuring stick you carry in your mind gently snapping in half and falling soundlessly into a deep, soft bed of damp pine needles beneath the trees. There is no need to force these fragments to decay at a specific speed. You can simply watch them sink downward into the dark loam of the forest floor, getting lighter and quieter with every passing breath. Feel the subtle, shifting relief as the pressure pulls away from the base of your neck, leaving your upper body feeling remarkably empty, porous, and entirely free from the requirement to maintain a permanent ledger of success. With your next long, effortless exhalation, you can choose to place the specific burden of your invisibility directly onto those twin mountain pine trees we encountered earlier, standing quietly on their narrow granite ledge. Picture the vast, open space of the mountain ridge stretching out in the twilight, and let the imagery change in its own time as you watch the dark layer of garden loam completely cover the stone. You do not need to do any of the active work of climbing higher or defending your branches against the storm. You can simply watch the slow, rhythmic whisper of the wind pass through the needles, leaving the trunks to share a single source of life. Sense the deep relief that arrives when you stop trying to push past the canopy, letting go of the entire project of measurement and leaving your spirit to rest in its own uncarved center. There is no promise that your sense of deficiency will completely dissolve into the air tonight, and there is no requirement to experience a sudden, dramatic breakthrough of emotional healing before you are allowed to close your eyes. The intention behind this gentle inner practice is simply to help you inhabit your own skeleton with a little less friction, showing your nervous system that it is entirely safe to step down from the stage of your old comparison for the next few hours. You can return to this soft, downward letting go whenever you notice your mind being pulled back into the cold workshops of historical obligation. Or you can simply let the visualization fade completely from your thoughts, returning your focus to the simple, physical reality of the cool pine-tinged air expanding your ribcage. Your life does not belong to a fixed, unyielding hierarchy, and your value as a living presence is not dependent on your ability to force yourself back into a mold that has become too narrow for your spirit. As the heavy weights of expectation are set down onto the stone, the space that opens up between your shoulders is not a terrifying void, but a soft, luminous freedom that has never forgotten how to breathe for itself. Let your arms and legs grow increasingly heavy, as if you are sinking into a deep bed of damp mountain soil that grows completely undisturbed by the marks written in old family ledgers. But there is still a deeper transformation waiting to reveal itself, a shift that moves from the softening of the clay to the complete acceptance of the single root. Now let this high mountain wisdom come slightly closer to your contemporary heart, as we prepare to look at a second, deeper journey that took place within an old stone quarry where the cleaved slate rests in absolute silence. 3 winters after the clay jar had been leveled under the cellar loam, Seiji climbed far beyond the familiar boundary fences of the monastery, ascending toward the steep, jagged western cliffs where the frost split the bedrock. Despite the quiet relief he had found while working in the root vault, a stubborn, hidden splinter still remained wedged directly behind his throat, a persistent, quiet dread that whenever he returned to his family's village, his brother's immense shadow would instantly reduce his life back to an unverified whisper. He had walked all morning through the freezing mist, carrying an iron wedge and a blunt mallet, tasked with collecting split roofing stones for the crumbling eaves of the kitchen house. He hoped the physical exertion on the high peak would numb the agonizing habit of rehearsing old arguments in his head, terrified that if he did not find a way to distinguish his own worth, his entire existence would remain an invisible footnote in his lineage. The physical focus of Seiji's deep internal conflict on this high ridge was a large slab of green mountain slate, which had been cleanly cleaved down the middle by the winter frost, leaving 2 separate, distinct stone faces that lay flat in the wild juniper bushes. This piece of mountain stone was a span wide, its split surface displaying a deep, unique pattern of swirling minerals. The left half of the slate was elevated, jagged, and caught the sharp glare of the pale mountain light, while the right half was thin, smooth, and lay deeply embedded in the damp, freezing moss below. As Seiji sat on an unhewn boulder beside them, his calloused hands feeling the freezing grain of the stone, his mind instantly fell into the old, punishing groove. He saw the high, sharp fragment as his brother's public brilliance, and the low, moss-bound half as an exact mirror of his own secondary, buried existence, replaying the exact moment his family had looked past him to celebrate another. The high pass was wrapped in a dense, shifting blanket of gray fog that smelled intensely of wild juniper, wet slate, and the cold ozone sting of high-altitude frost. There were no clear parables to follow along this vertical face. The mountain path had dissolved completely into the mist, and the only certainty was the low, continuous rattle of dry grass scraping against the raw rock in the wind. As the freezing dampness began to soak through the wool of his robes, a massive wave of internal resistance tightened across Sage's chest. His intellect began to fiercely construct a series of defensive explanations, convincing him that he had to separate his path entirely from his lineage, treating his own protective, angry thoughts as an absolute truth. He was gripping the iron handle of his mallet so tightly that his forearm muscles began to tremble with the strain, desperate to smash the higher stone to ease the sting in his heart. Sheltered from the bitter northern draft by a low ledge of rock, Seiji encountered an old mountain woodcutter named Tessin, a man who had lost his physical voice decades ago to an illness and spent his remaining years living in a rough stone windbreak, communicating only by pointing his weathered finger at the forest canopy. Tessin did not offer him a warm beverage to soothe his shivering frame, nor did he attempt to give him a piece of advice regarding the family line. Moving with a heavy, deliberate slow motion that seemed to share the ancient patience of the cliffs, the mute woodcutter reached down into the juniper brush and lifted both pieces of the frost-cleaved green slate, holding them side by side in his leather-gloved palms. Without a single sound of evaluation, the old woodcutter did not try to polish the rough edges or discard the lower piece of stone. Moving his thumb across the split faces with absolute quiet, he gently turned the two fragments over and pressed their jagged interiors back together, revealing that the high, sharp edge and the low, mossy curve matched perfectly along a single, unbroken vein of dark iron that ran straight through the heart of the original block. He looked directly into Seiji's wide, anxious eyes, his weathered face entirely untroubled by the great hierarchy of the valley below, and simply pointed his finger down toward the massive subterranean root of the mountain from which the slate had been born. Seiji felt a sudden, sharp release behind his sternum, his intellect spinning with the habit of viewing his brother as a separate, hostile force that existed only to diminish his light. But as he looked at the two pieces of stone held tightly in Tessin's hands, seeing how the inner vein belonged equally to both faces, he caught his breath mid-stride. He took a long, slow, horizontal inhalation of the juniper-scented fog, making a conscious, deliberate choice to stop the lifelong habit of treating his own bitter conclusions as an absolute reality. Instead of trying to break the stone or run away from the ridge, he relaxed his fingers, letting the iron mallet drop soundlessly into the damp grass. He chose to simply sit with the deep, unpolished uncertainty of his family history, forgiving the lack of validation without pretending the old hurt had not happened. The transformation did not magically alter his brother's personality, nor did it grant Seiji a sudden position of honor within the temple hierarchy. It changed the entire way he related to the hot friction between his shoulders, as he sat quietly in the freezing mist beside the mute woodcutter. Seeing the two pieces of slate laid gently back into the wild juniper, he realized that the surface differences between his life and his brother's were merely the external cleavage of a single, unified source. He stopped the exhausting habit of trying to carve a separate mountain for himself, choosing instead to anchor his awareness in the deep, shared vein that fed them both from the dark. A profound wave of self-forgiveness settled into his bones, leaving him resting on the cold ridge, no longer needing to outclimb anyone to know that his presence was completely whole. This silent integration amidst the high, mist-shrouded pass of the ridge lays bare the exact psychological grid that keeps your own thoughts spinning in a state of high nocturnal vigilance tonight. When you observe that frost-cleaved green slate resting flat in the wild juniper, its two distinct faces matching perfectly along a single dark vein, You are looking directly at the anatomy of your own familial exhaustion. The great delusion of our childhood conditioning is the belief that to be safe, valid, and structurally stable, we must continuously force our life path to outgrow the branches of those who share our lineage. We treat the natural differences in our trajectories, the variation in our material success, and the uneven distribution of family approval, not as a normal part of life's natural variance, but as a terrifying proof of personal deficiency, turning the simple reality of our siblings' growth into an existential threat to our own light. The emotional engine that drives this Latinite paralysis is a frantic, unconscious craving to control an inherently changing and unmeasured reality. When you lie awake in your room, your intellect spends its vital energy aggressively rehearsing future family encounters where you might look secondary or replaying past conversations to figure out exactly when your stature began to slide into the background. You take the high standards of a sibling's public brilliance and turn them into a tool of deep self-judgment, scolding your heart for its quietness and trying to fix your uncarved identity through a sense of structural shame. This constant effort to carve out a separate mountain creates a profound, agonizing split in your awareness, causing you to turn the pain of being overlooked into a permanent personal identity, as if you are a flawed fragment left to be buried by the dark. By illuminating this mechanical process, the relationship you hold with your own internal emptiness begins to undergo a profound, comforting transformation. Buddhist wisdom cuts through all academic complexity by dividing our emotional experience into two distinct dimensions: the initial pain that life naturally brings to our doorstep, and the secondary suffering that our own mind independently adds through its fierce resistance to reality. The first pain consists of the raw, unpolished conditions of your early environment, the physical reality that a brother or a sister received a different praise, the natural grief that arises when a family circle fails to recognize your unique value, and the quiet weight of navigating a lifelong comparison without an immediate resolution. These are the elements that you cannot always control, anticipate, or prevent, as they are part of the changing seasons of a developing family tree. The second pain, however, is the hot, sour friction that solidifies directly between your shoulder blades when your intellect refuses to let that initial unevenness simply exist without an aggressive interrogation. The second pain is what happens when you treat a single resentful thought as an absolute truth that must be solved before dawn, or when you use the very concepts of healing to scold your heart for feeling small in a world that has no permanent scorecards. When you spend your midnight hours trying to force an uncoupled branch to outgrow the canopy, you are actively feeding the second pain with your own hypervigilant attention, mistaking the natural arrival of rest for a personal failure. You are trying to scratch a deeper mark into the clay out of a heart that was always meant to return to its original, unmeasured nature. True peace, when encountered in the deep space of the late hours, is never the absolute absence of difficulty, nor is it a sterile state of existence where no sad family memories ever cross the threshold of your mind. Peace is found by establishing a fundamentally different relationship with that difficulty when it arrives. Learning to sit comfortably within the fog of your own lineage without needing to force an immediate new victory. You do not have to force your internal noise to become perfectly silent to deserve your rest tonight, and you do not need to outshine anyone else's achievements before your body is permitted to settle into the dark. The moment you pause the frantic, comparative effort to look entirely sufficient, the rigid scaffolding across your upper shoulders naturally relinquishes its density, allowing your attention to pool deeply in the center of your resting frame. You discover that your true luminous presence is like those twin mountain pines, inherently whole, completely resilient, and entirely capable of sharing a single source of life, precisely because it possesses the capacity to let the high winds pass through its needles without resistance. The deep, unlit vein of your awareness is moving safely beneath the competitive static at this very moment, completely uncompromised by the high expectations you have placed upon your chest, waiting only for you to pull your hands inside the perimeter of the raft and trust the shared root to hold you up. This high mountain wisdom, pulled from cleaved green slate and the silent expansion of cold floorboards, is not a collection of beautiful concepts meant to be stored away in a quiet corner of your intellect, existing only while you listen to a steady voice in the darkness. It is a soft, practical cadence designed to be carried directly into the noisy, unpolished friction of your contemporary afternoon. True inner peace is never an elusive, monumental milestone that you master by permanently fixing your entire structural history. At once it is practiced and reclaimed in the smallest, most ordinary pauses of your daily survival. It is found in that brief, hidden space that opens up between an empty hour that triggers your fear of obsolescence and the sudden, reactive contraction that tightens directly between your shoulder blades before you reach for your device to manufacture a new task. Think of how frequently the old habit of using a forced, artificial efficiency to hide your internal sense of purposelessness returns to your side during a standard week, masquerading as the frantic urge to organize your surroundings when you are feeling entirely unanchored, or the exhausting effort of smiling brightly at a meeting, while your inner landscape feels completely heavy, detached, and cold inside. You might notice this rigid armor locking into place when you are lying awake at night, replaying a minor professional mistake, or comparing your own uncoupled progress with the seemingly immaculate, high-speed trajectories of people you see online. The mind quickly treats these moments of transition as a catastrophic personal deficiency, causing you to feel profoundly behind in life, as if you are a flawed engine that has failed to maintain the collective rotation around the family circle. We live in an accelerated environment that continuously pushes us to present an unyielding, perfectly optimized exterior to the world, leaving many of us feeling deeply lonely and hidden beneath the weight of our own historical velocity. Out of a fear of uncertainty, you might try to overanalyze a changing relationship or fear a future financial transition, using the very concepts of self-care to judge your own natural fatigue. You treat your own changing capacity as a malfunctioning water clock that must be aggressively forced back into the traditional rhythm, convincing yourself that you must earn your right to absolute rest by first achieving a spotless state of external utility that leaves no room for raw, unpolished human transitions. But Buddhist insight gently invites you to step down from the stage of your old utility tomorrow, showing you that a single breath before answering a demanding message is a profound form of living wisdom that requires no professional credentials. You do not need to reshape your entire daily routine into a permanent engine of output to be worthy of your space on this earth, and you can care deeply about the projects in your life without gripping their validation so tightly that your own nervous system remains in a state of constant, defensive tension. Not every hypervigilant thought that crosses your mind deserves your absolute obedience. And not every floating feeling of uselessness is an unshakable command that must be solved before the sun breaks through the window. You can rest without earning it first, letting go of the performative need to appear functional, and allowing your unhewn stone to simply touch the ground. The next time you find yourself wanting rest but feeling an acute wave of guilt for resting, remember that the vastness of your true presence carries an innate capacity to hold both your longing for meaning and your need for complete immobility together in the same wide channel, without requiring a flawless performance. This practical shift in your daily habit does not mean the complex realities of your modern schedule will suddenly lose their weight. It means you become a far more porous, resilient, and unbothered presence within your own skin, because your fundamental safety is no longer dependent on keeping your internal air vents blocked by an excess of structural panic. You are entirely permitted to let the world move on without your perfect supervision for the next few hours, letting go of the gears of your analytical thoughts and allowing your physical frame to sink into the heavy gravity of the evening. Let this realization soften the remaining scaffolding between your shoulder blades as the room around you grows increasingly cool, preparing your awareness to dissolve completely into the unlit source of the dark night. The damp mountain fog that swirled across the high vertical pass all evening has finally grown completely still, leaving the dark, unpolished boards of your room untouched by the slightest trace of friction. The hot, Sour tension that was anchoring itself directly between your shoulder blades has lost its last remaining density, leaving nothing but a vast, porous emptiness where the old weight of familial comparison used to rest. Your body feels immensely heavy against the linen, sinking steadily into the unyielding foundation of the mattress, as if your entire skeleton is finally relinquishing its long, performative vigil against the possibility of being overlooked. You do not need to maintain the illusion of a separate stature. For the remainder of this night, you are entirely permitted to let the heavy, tensed scaffolding of your past measurements collapse into the quiet dark. Let your breathing become an absolute whisper, a shallow and completely effortless tide that requires no tracking, no verification, and no intellectual intervention from your tired heart. The twin mountain pine trees that stood on their narrow granite ledge all winter are sitting in perfect immobility beneath the heavy gray mist, their green needles completely saturated by the cool midnight moisture. The frantic urge to reach higher or outgrow the companion canopy has dissolved into the open air, leaving the branches to rest listlessly beneath the silent night sky, entirely unbothered by the wide, empty space of the ridge stretching out into the dark. The internal space between your shoulders is completely unmeasured, completely uncoupled, and entirely free from the requirement to hold a traditional scorecard for the circle outside. You can stop trying to force a separate route into the shifting mountain stone tonight. The ancient, frost-cleaved piece of green slate has been left flat in the wild juniper bushes behind the stone windbreak, and there are no uneven lines left to smooth, no traditional expectations to satisfy, and no childhood roles to repair with the frantic labor of your intellect. The dark layer of cellar loam has settled completely over the primitive clay, cutting off the old marks and leaving the immediate surface to rest in absolute, unresisting passivity. You do not have to bridge the gap between who you were and what you will achieve next before your eyes can close, because the true, luminous depth of your awareness has never once been broken by the heights of your lineage. Sink down deeper into the stillness, letting the tiny muscles around your eyes go entirely slack, letting the weight of your limbs dissolve into the mattress like coarse mountain salt, softening beneath a single drop of clean water, leaving your temples feeling cool, wide, and entirely spacious. The wild juniper along the vertical ridge is resting in the midnight fog, spreading its loose, fragrant leaves toward the darkness, without a single thought of hierarchy, completely content to exist exactly where the mountain dictates. You are returning home to an undivided baseline of presence that existed long before you ever learned to measure your worth by another's growth, or turn a temporary lack of validation into an absolute proof of deficiency. This spacious ground is your original sanctuary, a timeless expanse that asks for no permanent ledgers of success, requires no immaculate displays of functioning, and demands no fixed positions to grant you rest. Allow yourself to slide completely beneath the surface of this perfect stillness, letting your name, your history, and your emotional fatigue dissolve like fine mountain soil. Washing clean from the inner vein of an old stone block, the low, continuous clack of the analytical mind trying to outrun an invisible shadow has completely died away, leaving only the soft, cooling whisper of the wind passing through the shared roots to soothe the rough knots of your being. You have full permission to leave your entire family history completely unmanaged and uncorrected until the sun climbs over the eastern cliffs, trusting the heavy, uncarved structure of your body to hold its own presence without your supervision. Let your mind go entirely dark, letting your soul drift down into the boundless, unlit quiet where you are already completely safe, completely unfragmented, and perfectly at peace. When the two separate faces are pressed back together along the hidden vein of the stone, what is left to divide the mountain from itself? Nothing remains but the unbroken density of the unhewn stone, a single, silent mass that resting deeply in the earth, completely indifferent to the storms that pass across its surface. The analytical intellect spent decades operating under the heavy delusion that your identity was a separate, fragile fragment that had to be continuously chiseled, polished, and elevated above the surrounding terrain to avoid being buried by the dark. It taught you to view the natural variance of your lineage as an ongoing conflict, an unvoiced arena where an author's expansion automatically meant your own erasure. But when you sink into the motionless gravity of this quiet room, letting go of the need to defend your stature, you begin to see that the deep sky of your awareness has never been divided by the patterns of your lineage. The mountain does not scold the lower ledge for its placement, nor does the dark loam require the roots to explain their twisting paths before feeding them with the cool moisture of the winter frost. Your fundamental reality is like that unrefined mountain salt held within the clay jar, pure, essential, and entirely unaffected by the uneven scratches carved into the exterior by a passing hand. The old family roles you struggled to outgrow, the moments where you felt small or invisible at the communal table, and the deep somatic ache of trying to prove your worth were merely passing shadows on a bedrock that remains completely solid, cool, and undisturbed in its quietest chambers. The long years you spent replaying old conversations and checking your achievements against a sibling's timeline have not altered your internal sanctuary by a single fraction, because the pure presence that holds your heart has no competitive scale to maintain, and no heights that must be reached to justify its existence on this earth. The moment you allow the frantic necessity of constant self-measurement to drop away into the darkness, you are not losing your ground. You are finally permitting your soul to return to the unbroken baseline of its original freedom. A mind that remains locked in a state of high familial vigilance can only interpret a quiet evening as an empty space that must be filled with new anxieties, using the old mechanisms of shame to force a tired, changing life back into an unyielding definition. By choosing to step down from the stage of your old comparison for the remainder of this night, you are allowing your nervous system to fully absorb the soft, grounding stability of the evening, letting the defensive scaffolding between your shoulder blades dissolve naturally at its own organic pace. You are discovering that you do not need to reshape your entire life path to earn your basic right to rest, because your value as a living being was already completely whole long before you ever learned to score your achievements against another's light. Let your breath become an even slower, more effortless whisper, a quiet, rhythmic tide that expands and releases within the wide, space cradle of your attention without any interference from your intellect. The remaining tightness that was clamping down at the base of your neck has completely lost its density, melting away like a handful of dry garden soil softening beneath the midnight moisture, leaving your upper body feeling remarkably empty, porous, and free. You do not have to figure out a grand design for your future encounters before your eyes are allowed to close, and you do not need to mend every piece of your childhood history before your frame is permitted to sink into the heavy gravity of the bed. The dark night accepts your uncarved journey exactly as it is right now, quiet, unmeasured, and beautifully unencored, asking for nothing but your willingness to set down the heavy iron tools of your analytical thoughts and trust the supportive ground to carry you down into the deep. Feel the immense, stabilizing comfort that arrives when you step out of the illusion that your worth is a finite resource that can be outshone by another, allowing your entire skeleton to give up its long, exhausting sprint against time. The remaining echoes of your family roles are turning into faint, formless shadows now, distant like the low rustle of dry grass scraping against a piece of wet slate miles away from your window pane. They float across the perimeter of your awareness without catching your grip, losing their sharp boundaries and dissolving back into the silent, supportive network of the evening. You are drifting deeper and deeper into the warm, boundless current of a dreamless rest, a spacious realm where every scorecard is softly forgotten, every heavy weight is lifted, and your spirit is finally, beautifully at home in the quiet dark. Let yourself slide completely beneath the surface of this perfect stillness, knowing that the world will continue to turn without your supervision, and that you are already completely safe, completely unfragmented, and perfectly at peace. Within this undisturbed sanctuary, the boundary lines that once parsed your life into separate fractions lose their reality completely, exposing the timeless expanse that has always sustained your presence beneath the surface of things. The intellect spends its existence operating under the false impression that it must continuously guard your position in the lineage, acting like an anxious architect trying to fortify a fortress that was never under siege. It convinces you that your basic belonging is a scarce and fragile element, a commodity that must be aggressively negotiated or won through a relentless presentation of your unique achievements and public brilliance. But as you sink deeper into the unforced gravity of the late hours, you discover that the vast sky of your awareness cannot be diminished by a season of quietness, nor can it be outshone by the brilliant trajectory of another. The twin pines do not waste their vitality comparing the reach of their branches, they simply exist, allowing the mountain wind to sing through their needles, completely content to rest in the single source that holds them both above the gorge. Your fundamental reality is like that hidden vein of dark iron, running straight through the frost-cleaved slate, an indestructible, unifying thread that remains perfectly intact, regardless of how many pieces the surface has been split into by the winter weather. The ancient anxieties about whether you have lived up to the family name, the hidden guilt of moving at a different pace, and the somatic phantom pressure of always needing to look perfectly sufficient are merely passing weather systems on a stone floor that remains completely solid, cool, and undisturbed in its deep foundations. The long decades you spent translating your vital energy into a machine of constant comparison have not compromised your internal ground by a single fraction, because the pure awareness that holds your heart has no quota that must be fulfilled, and no deadlines that can be broken by the simple arrival of your fatigue. When you allow the frantic habit of checking the mind for a new competitive edge to dissolve into the shadows of the room, you are not losing your orientation. You are finally permitting your soul to return to the unbroken baseline of its original freedom. A heart that is trapped in a state of continuous structural vigilance can only interpret an empty hour as an existential deficit, using the old mechanisms of internal shame to force a tired, changing life back into an outdated mold. By making the conscious, deliberate choice to step down from the stage of your old comparison, for the remainder of this night, you are permitting your nervous system to fully absorb the cool, stabilizing moisture of the evening, letting the rigid boundaries of your past titles soften naturally at their own organic pace. You are discovering that you do not need to justify your existence to the darkness to deserve the absolute comfort of this bed, because your value as a living presence was already fully complete, long before you ever learned to measure your days by a collective standard of success. Let your breath become an even slower, more effortless whisper, a quiet, rhythmic tide that requires no intervention from your intellect, simply expanding and releasing within the wide, spacious cradle of your attention. The remaining tightness that was vibrating across your upper shoulders has completely lost its hold, dissolving like a handful of dry pine needles settling into the deep loam of the forest floor, leaving your muscles feeling remarkably light, porous, and free. You do not have to figure out a grand design for your future mornings before your eyes are allowed to close, and you do not need to heal every piece of your professional grief before your body is permitted to sink into the heavy gravity of the mattress. The dark night accepts your uncoupled journey exactly as it is right now, quiet, unmeasured, and beautifully unencored, asking for nothing but your willingness to set down the heavy iron tools of your analytical mind and trust the supportive ground to carry you down into the deep. Feel the immense, stabilizing comfort that arrives when you step out of the illusion that your worth as a living being is identical to your output, allowing your entire frame to give up its long, exhausting sprint against time. The remaining echoes of your modern responsibilities are turning into faint, formless shadows now, distant like the low gurgle of an unchanneled spring, moving beneath the stone steps of an empty garden miles away from your window pane. They float across the perimeter of your awareness without catching your grip, losing their sharp perimeters and dissolving back into the silent, supportive network of the evening. You are drifting deeper and deeper into the warm, boundless current of a dreamless rest, a spacious realm where every schedule is softly forgotten, every heavy weight is lifted, and your spirit is finally beautifully at home in the quiet dark. Let yourself slide completely beneath the surface of this perfect stillness, knowing that the world will continue to turn without your supervision. and that you are already completely safe, completely unfragmented, and perfectly at peace. In this profound, unmeasured stillness, the need to maintain an individual outpost against the tide of history simply evaporates, leaving your spirit to dissolve into the quiet, unmapped sanctuary of pure awareness. The intellect often clings to its old narratives out of a primitive fear that if it stops its fierce defensive counting, there will be nothing left to anchor your presence in the universe. It treats the soft, open gaps in your life as a dangerous isolation, a barren wilderness where your worth will be forever buried beneath the success of those around you. But as you sink deeper into the warm, unforced gravity of this dark room, you realize that the space holding your life is not a terrifying void, but a soft, luminous freedom that has never required a public victory to remain entirely whole. The mountain pines do not compete for the sky, they simply allow their needles to be polished by the frost, resting in the absolute, unquestioned validity of their shared source. Your fundamental reality is like that cool mountain spring moving silently beneath the dark cellar stones, an unchanneled, beautiful current that flows effortlessly without ever needing to prove its depth to the world outside. The ancient, heavy burdens of trying to outgrow a family role, the agonizing midnight habit of tallying past slights, and the deep somatic anxiety of feeling inherently not enough are merely temporary shadows on a granite ledge that remains completely solid, resilient and undisturbed in its most sacred core. The long winters you spent trying to secure a separate, more impressive mark on the clay have not depleted your inner sanctuary by a single drop, because the deep space that holds your chest has no parameters that can be frayed by comparison, and no boundaries that can be broken by an excess of human expectation. When you pause the frantic effort to carve a distinct identity for yourself, you are not losing your footing. You are finally allowing your spirit to return to the unbroken baseline of its original nature. A heart that is trapped in a state of continuous familial vigilance can only look at an empty calendar as a threat to its survival, using the old mechanisms of internal judgment to force a tired, changing life back into an unyielding mold. By choosing to step down from the stage of your old comparison for the remainder of this night, you are permitting your nervous system to fully absorb the soft, grounding stability of the evening, letting the defensive scaffolding between your shoulder blades dissolve naturally at its own organic pace. You are discovering that you do not need to win the approval of the family circle to deserve the absolute comfort of this bed, because your value as a living being was already fully complete, long before you ever learned to score your achievements against another's light. Let your breath become an even slower, more effortless whisper, a quiet, rhythmic tide that requires no intervention from your intellect, simply expanding and releasing within the wide, spacious cradle of your attention. The remaining tightness that was clamping down at the base of your neck has completely lost its density, melting away like a handful of dry garden soil, softening beneath the midnight moisture, leaving your upper body feeling remarkably empty, porous, and free. You do not have to figure out a grand design for your future encounters before your eyes are allowed to close, and you do not need to mend every piece of your childhood history before your frame is permitted to sink into the heavy gravity of the bed. The dark night accepts your uncarved journey exactly as it is right now, quiet, unmeasured, and beautifully unencored, asking for nothing but your willingness to set down the heavy iron tools of your analytical thoughts and trust the supportive ground to carry you down into the deep. Feel the immense, stabilizing comfort that arrives when you step out of the illusion that your worth is a finite resource that can be outshone by another, allowing your entire skeleton to give up its long, exhausting sprint against time. The remaining echoes of your family roles are turning into faint, formless shadows now, distant like the low rustle of dry grass scraping against a piece of wet slate miles away from your window pane. They float across the perimeter of your awareness without catching your grip, losing their sharp boundaries and dissolving back into the silent, supportive network of the evening. You are drifting deeper and deeper into the warm, boundless current of a dreamless rest, a spacious realm where every scorecard is softly forgotten, every heavy weight is lifted, and your spirit is finally beautifully at home in the quiet dark. Let yourself slide completely beneath the surface of this perfect stillness, knowing that the world will continue to turn without your supervision, and that you are already completely safe, completely unfragmented, and perfectly at peace. In this vast, unmapped dark, the very notion of a separate self trying to maintain its height against the world dissolves completely, revealing a stillness that requires no defense. The intellect spent a lifetime convincing you that your safety was a competitive resource, a prize that had to be continuously extracted from the evaluations of your family or the achievements of your peers. It taught your nervous system to remain on high alert, bracing your ribs and clamping down between your shoulders to ensure your unique existence wouldn't be swallowed by another's expansion. But as you sink further into the soft gravity of the late hours, letting go of the entire project of measurement, you discover that the spacious field of your presence has never been small. The two mountain pines do not count the needles on each other's boughs, they simply share the single unlit current moving through the stone, fully sustained by a depth that knows absolutely nothing of division. Your true, indestructible nature is like that deep iron vein running straight through the frost-cleaved slate, perfectly whole, completely silent, and entirely uncompromised regardless of how many fragments the surface has been split into by the passing seasons. The old family patterns you struggled to outgrow, the deep somatic memory of feeling secondary around your own lineage, and the quiet midnight habit of replaying old slights are merely temporary shadows on a granite ledge that remains completely solid, cool, and undisturbed in its deep foundations. The long winters you spent trying to carve a more impressive mark into your history have not depleted your inner sanctuary by a single drop, because the pure awareness that holds your heart has no quota that must be satisfied, and no titles that must be secured to justify its space on this earth. When you allow the frantic necessity of constant comparison to fade into the dim light of the room, you are not losing your ground. You are finally permitting your spirit to return to the unbroken baseline of its original freedom. A heart that is trapped in a state of continuous familial vigilance can only look at an empty hour as a threat to its survival, using the old mechanisms of internal judgment to force a tired, changing life back into an unyielding definition. By choosing to step down from the stage of your old comparison for the remainder of this night, you are permitting your nervous system to fully absorb the soft, grounding stability of the evening, letting the defensive scaffolding between your shoulder blades dissolve naturally at its own organic pace. You are discovering that you do not need to win the approval of the family circle to deserve the absolute comfort of this bed, because your value as a living being was already fully complete long before you ever learned to score your achievements against another's light. Let your breath become an even slower, more effortless whisper, a quiet, rhythmic tide that requires no intervention from your intellect, simply expanding and releasing within the wide, spacious cradle of your attention. The remaining tightness that was clamping down at the base of your neck has completely lost its density, melting away like a handful of dry garden soil, softening beneath the midnight moisture, leaving your upper body feeling remarkably empty, porous and free. You do not have to figure out a grand design for your future encounters before your eyes are allowed to close, and you do not need to mend every piece of your childhood history before your frame is permitted to sink into the heavy gravity of the bed. The dark night accepts your uncarved journey exactly as it is right now, quiet, unmeasured, and beautifully unencored, asking for nothing but your willingness to set down the heavy iron tools of your analytical thoughts and trust the supportive ground to carry you down into the deep. Feel the immense, stabilizing comfort that arrives when you step out of the illusion that your worth is a finite resource that can be outshone by another, allowing your entire skeleton to give up its long, exhausting sprint against time. The remaining echoes of your family roles are turning into faint, formless shadows now, distant like the low rustle of dry grass scraping against a piece of wet slate miles away from your window pane. They float across the perimeter of your awareness without catching your grip, losing their sharp boundaries and dissolving back into the silent, supportive network of the evening. You are drifting deeper and deeper into the warm, boundless current of a dreamless rest, a spacious realm where every scorecard is softly forgotten, every heavy weight is lifted, and your spirit is finally, beautifully at home in the quiet dark. Let yourself slide completely beneath the surface of this perfect stillness, knowing that the world will continue to turn without your supervision, and that you are already completely safe, completely unfragmented, and perfectly at peace.